drag racing had its time. Car show stuff had its time. We were young, we were willing to take risks. We really believed in the product. We felt we could do an awesome event. When we opened the gates, in 2004, and we saw the crowd that was coming, we were like, oh my gosh, this is actually a thing. Our events are very loud, ruckus, tons of people attending. It's screaming, it's going crazy, it's flaming on the internet, it's freaking out, it's, having the time of your life.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Georgie's Stripping the Dipping podcast. I'm your host, F1 Black. And this week, we speak to the co-founder and president of Formula Drift. Ryan Sage combined his business and marketing background with his passion for tuning cars. Ryan and his business partner, Jim Lior, introduced Japan's D1 Grand Prix to the United States. And since then, the pair have grown Formula Drift to what it is today. So without further ado, sit back, relax, and let's hear from Ryan about Formula Drift's 21-year journey. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, first of all, we ask all of our guests to introduce themselves to our listeners. So if you were meeting one of our listeners, how would you introduce yourself?
Generally speaking, if it's in a business setting, I say, hey, I'm Ryan Sage from Formula Drift. And then, that either piques people's interest or, they want to learn more about it. And, then we get into a conversation. It has definitely changed over the years. When you say the term or the phrase that includes drifting in your introductions or meeting people, in the early days, nobody really even knew the word. And now it's pretty much common nomenclature. So it really just depends on who's on the receiving end.
Yeah, you're right. There's kind of been this move, I hope you don't take it as an insult, but kind of like a growth in the mainstream awareness of drifting. But if we rewind the clock, what's your earliest motorsport memory?
Oh, gosh. I got into this fairly young. I would always been into cars, but was really only connected with like the Southern California drag racing scene that was starting to develop. And ironically, some of the people that were like the big boys in that during that time frame are actually part of our series now, and we didn't even know that until later on. But I had been interested in kind of building cars and being involved in what people were calling kind of like the tuner market. So this is going to be late 90s, and probably my first memory was buying my first car that I knew I was going to do something with it. That's not necessarily directly motorsports related, but it was because of motorsports that I got interested in wanting to play a personal role in my life. And so it's hard to track down that exact moment. I've always been a fan of Formula One, for example. That's where the word formula comes from in Formula Drift. But it really just started off as being an enthusiast.
No, absolutely. And you talk about the kind of tuner, I guess, demographic. I remember, in my late teens, early 20s, there were a group of people in my friendship group that all, had, I guess here we call them hatchbacks, but maybe in America, everything's bigger. You have bigger cars, but everyone would be thinking, oh, I've got a spoiler, I've tuned my engine, etc. Was that quite a big, movement? Because we're talking about before the internet really caught hold. Was that quite a big pastime for people back in the late 90s, early noughties?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, there was definitely, I guess, clicks, so to speak, is a phrase or a term that I've heard used a lot. There were the drag racing guys, and then there were the show guys. And, during that time, Fast and the Furious had started to make waves, but there had already been a culture of people that were building cars, and then starting to focus on, going to the car shows, so to speak. There was a brand called Hot Import Nights, which is still kind of around today. It was where I got my first real job, but they were doing nighttime car shows, and we're really hitting it out of the park, and seeing some real success with not just the number of cars that were participating, but the people that were just coming to see these cars and be part of that automotive movement. And I think Fast and the Furious kind of set off some interest in the aftermarket in odd ways, so to speak. But it certainly, I think, played a role in some of the general public kind of knowing that this was out there, whatever this is, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm having flashbacks. I live in a part of the UK, basically Essex, which is just north of London. And I remember my friends took me, it's like an industrial estate. And, I'm not going to impugn your great moral character with the illegal activity that I witnessed, but they'd
Yeah.
kind of like put diesel down in this industrial estate, and it was all rear wheel drive cars. And they were just basically like, it was almost like ice skating, the cars were like dancing around. Like, what would you say the most grassroots level of that kind of tuner or drift scene was back then?
Well, I mean, this would have been before drifting really even had an underground appeal in the United States. I mean, to be honest with you, like, I had never really seen drifting or heard of drifting outside of Japan prior to like 1997 or something like that. It wasn't part of the zeitgeist, even on the underground. So everybody, people out here in California were going to LACR to go drag race their cars. There was multiple drag racing sanctioning bodies. And then you had the car show guys. And so you kind of basically had these two ends of the spectrum, the guys that were, wanting to build their cars to take it to car shows, and other guys that were interested in going fast, and, traveling around with different, drag racing sanctioning bodies. So I think, that's kind of the way that I remember it. And when drifting kind of came into my consciousness was really when I stepped out of what I was doing with Hot Important Nights, and met my partner who was there for a certain period of time. And then we started seeing the Option videos, Option magazine, some of the underground stuff that was happening with drifting. And then, of course, the D1 Grand Prix had kind of started around that time. And that was our first kind of like introduction to it.
When I was preparing for the show, I was thinking drifting, drifting. Where do I like? What was my first interaction? I remember I went to college or university, and my friend showed me this anime called Initial D, and this
Mhm.
is either going to land with you or you're going to think I'm a complete geek. But like, how much did that how much were you aware of that at the time it came out?
Very much so. I mean, I think everybody that was interested in drifting knew about Initial D, but not everybody that was interested in Initial D knew about drifting, if that makes sense. Um, it's it certainly had a real cultural phenomenon, that certainly played a role in, I think, the cool aspect of drifting at that time. But I think you could very easily, be an Initial D fan and not necessarily know or be accustomed to the idea or the fact that there was a physical version of that going on in reality.
No, of course, and I mean, I must admit that I didn't watch every episode of Initial D, but I do remember the kind of, I think it must have been the first one. The main character is delivering eggs for his father's business or something, and essentially it's about how he's learning to drift. And I don't know how true this is, but essentially the way not to drift is just to pull up the handbrake. Actually, it's about spinning the rear wheels. So, like, just using that as an analogy or as a segue, can you tell our listeners how to drift?
Yeah, I mean, the easiest version of it is kind of what you described there. It's about breaking the traction loose in such a way around a corner that, you start to have to, steer the steering wheel in the opposite direction to keep making that corner. And, there's obviously a very rich history to this type of driving before it was called drifting, going back to the early days of, Formula One and open car racing, where as they were taking these corners, the inertia was pushing the back end out, and they were having to counter steer to make sure that they stayed, in the corner. and that I've seen photos and videos of stuff going back to probably the 1940s where that was happening, maybe even earlier. And in the modern era, when you're looking at like Initial D, for example, you're really talking about a lower horsepower car where you're trying to push it around a corner so that the traction breaks loose on the rears and you can counter steer with the fronts. That is undeniably, and not exaggerating at all, almost exactly the opposite of what is happening today. Today, it's about having as much grip as possible, but building the cars so that they are able to break traction very, very easily, and doing so with 7, 8, 900, 1,000 horsepower vehicles, where driving around a corner fast enough and tight enough to where the rear end starts breaking out and you counter steer, is not even the concept anymore.
Wow. I mean, that sounds like almost the sport is inverted, and it would be interesting to hear your story because you obviously were co-founder of Formula Drift. But before we get there, I kind of obviously do a bit of research before each episode, and I look at people's sort of academic background, and I saw business marketing in yours, and that's actually not uncommon for people that then go into motorsport. So, were you kind of a motorsport fanatic, trying to get into business marketing as a way to participate in that kind of motorsport community, or was it the other way around? You did business marketing and then found yourself in motorsport. How did that work?
So it's kind of interesting. Yeah. So when I was working at Hot Import Nights, I was doing so in what they were calling the marketing department, and that was really just about, at that time, before the internet, was about reaching out to customers and clients and letting them know that we had an event going on. And it was a very simplistic kind of grassroots organizational structure of working with promoters in certain areas and et cetera, et cetera. But along the way, what I learned being there is that there's a lot more complexity to marketing than just getting fans to come to your event. There's working with sponsors on marketing activations. There is trying to figure out what does an ROI look like, or in modern terms a KPI look like for a certain brand at an event, and even outside of the event, because now these things are 365. And so when I left the Hot Import Nights gig, my partner and we started a company called Slipstream. And ironically, Slipstream is obviously a racing term. So that had some of the, kind of the philosophy behind what we were trying to do. And what we were essentially doing was what you would call now modern day agency work. So we had essentially started an agency without really knowing it. And that agency was meant to basically help brands do the right kind of marketing in the space that we were in. Because what we were seeing is that brands would come in, and this was on the heel of Hot Import Nights and Fast and the Furious. Brands would come in, they wouldn't know how to market to this demographic. They'd have a bad experience, they'd leave, and they'd never come back. And so we kind of saw that there was an opportunity there to help them do it right, to be able to speak the right kind of language to the fans that are in this industry and that are coming to these events. And so we started taking on clients. We took on clients like Mazda and JC Whitney, and eBay Motors, just to kind of help them do things that were going to make them stand out in a reputable way amongst the consumers. And it was through that process that we got well known enough to basically, look at an RFP, request for proposal, from the Japanese drifting group that wanted to bring an event here to the United States. So, there's a lot of details to fill in there, but that's kind of how it went.
No, I mean, thank you. I often say to our listeners that I'm trying to kind of get the intellectual property of our guests, and albeit this was from 20 odd years ago, what I'm hearing, and you used the word language, and I was almost going to say that before you did. You kind of understand a demographic or a group of people, and you can help brands interact with them and build a relationship with them that hopefully is profitable for both sides.
Yeah,
Um,
I
yeah.
mean, our general philosophy back in the agency days, and like it's funny because we didn't even know that we had an agency. It was basically two guys doing what you would call agency work, and we had a company. Um, and the interesting thing about that is that the philosophy of getting people to come in and do things that speak to the audience is still pretty much what we do with our brand relationships in Formula Drift today. We are very much against a brand coming in for 1 year, having a bad experience and leaving, even if they pay a ton of money. We would rather have, retention rates of 15, 16. We've had brands up to 19 years involved in the sport. And those are, to us, better and more successful relationships than a quick hit because somebody wants to be involved in the new cool kid sport or whatever.
I get that, and in a way, I'm trying to think of the word. It's kind of like respect, I guess, because you're respecting the brands and not trying to kind of take everything you can from them in a short period, but you're also respecting that group of people that you're marketing to, and what they want. I mean, you're in Slipstream, and you moved from there to founding Formula Drift. Before you founded Formula Drift, was it? What gave you the sense that you wanted to do something different?
You mean the sense of like, oh, we should be moving on into the drifting space?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that was obviously not obviously because I have to tell you, but to us, looking at it in hindsight, with the benefit of that hindsight, it was really a fortuitous moment that was not planned. Um, we had made enough waves, so to speak, in the industry with this agency, and everybody knew that our backgrounds were from the event side. So I was from Hot Import Nights, and my partner Jim was on the drag racing side. So you had the motorsports plus the car show kind of dudes together. And when we found out that the D1 Grand Prix wanted to do a special one-off event in 2004 and a lead-up event to do a kind of a driver search for local drivers, we jumped at the opportunity to try and do that. And at that time, we were not very well capitalized, so it was like but we knew that speaking to the Japanese, doing face-to-face meetings is really important, as it is in many parts of Asian culture. And so, we flew to Japan to do the meeting, and that ended up allowing us to get the gig. And at that point, basically, there was about an 18-month period where we were focused just on the D1 event, the driver search leading up to the actual event in 2004. And while we were still doing our agency stuff on the side, our focus was really on trying to knock this out of the park, because I think we saw an opportunity to build off of where we came from in the event space. Drag racing had its time, car show stuff had its time. In a sense, drifting is a combination of those two things. It's obviously very different in some respects, but there is a show and go aspect to drifting. And particularly at that time, I can remember being like, wow, these cars are so cool. They're awesome. They look great. We don't see these kind of cars here in the United States. And, the action is unbelievable. I mean, it's so cool. And so there was kind of like this, we really need to do this right and, knock it out of the park. And so we set out to basically do that once we got the gig, and, try to make it the best event we could.
One of the kind of common themes of successful guests we have is this level of modesty. So, I'm not saying I'm particularly stoic, but there's a phrase I love, which is luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. And it sounds like you guys had the skills and the kind of networks and the experience to pounce when the opportunity arose. Could you tell us a bit about that D1 the D1 event, and I suppose like over time, what the journey has been to go from where you started to what Formula Drift became today. It's a big one, I know.
Yeah, I mean, and by the way, I can certainly appreciate the stoic comment. I'm actually looking at a copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations right now that I keep at my desk at all times. So it's one of my favorite books. But yeah, I would say that the preparation for that was very, in hindsight, very odd because we were dealing with a a group of you know business organizers from Japan that were trying to do an event here that needed an on the ground team to do it. And there's definitely a language barrier, even though that we had translators, and there's definitely a like, hey, this is what's going on at the event. They were not necessarily prepared to drift a banked oval, which was something new, because we did the event at Irwindale Speedway. And so there was a lot of interesting back and forth with the benefit of hindsight, that in the modern context would have probably been too hard to overcome. But I think at that time in our kind of our business development, we were young. We were willing to take risks. We really believed in the product. We felt we could do an awesome event, and we worked through it, from the driver's search all the way to the main event. And then when we actually like opened the gates, and again, this is like pre-internet, when we opened the gates, in 2004, and we saw the crowd that was coming, we were like, oh my gosh, this is actually a thing. And it was on the back of that we really started thinking about maybe this is where our focus and attention needs to be, because it was just such an impactful event. But even if you go back and look, I think you can find DVD recordings of it. But if you go back and look at the competition, I was thinking that then, but if I'm using my modern regular eyes that I'm used to for watching drifting events now, it was nothing like what we see today. And so to be excited about that must have meant that it was just so unique, in that particular moment, and worthy of continuing to explore and try to develop.
I mean, it's interesting you talk about your perspective now, and how you experience something you could watch now, not necessarily be shocked by, but at the time it was cutting edge. You talked a bit earlier in the episode that essentially the idea of drifting, particularly at that professional level, has changed because the horsepower has basically gone up a heck of a lot. And so grip levels also have to go up, but you can break traction more easily because of the amount of power. What do you think's driven that? Do you think that's just sort of like the competition over the years, that desire to do something different every year?
I think that the American culture on drifting had a profound impact on the philosophy of developing cars, within drifting, and we've seen some adoption of that, um, in the Japanese side of things, where horsepower has gone up, and you know trying to develop, a chassis that is perfect for drifting, but also is accommodative of the types of tires that are part of the kind of strict regulations depending on what series you're in. The very first time we saw an American drifter, an American car, was at the very first Formula Drift event in 2004, and it was a Pontiac GTO. And then alongside of that, we saw a Dodge Viper. Now, those two things are completely, I don't want to say antithetical, but just unknown in the Japanese performance side of things, particularly with drifting. You're going to get a lot of S14s, S15s. You're going to get, some four-door, longer wheelbase cars that are, that kind of have a cool aesthetic to it. And, we had guys that were developing these, essentially brand new off the lot, American made cars. And I think the moment that you do that, the moment that you pop a V8, in a car, and in the case of the GTO, was available with that, and in the case of the Viper, it's a 12-cylinder engine. Automatically, the horsepower wars, so to speak, I think kind of had its beginning. And, it was off of the basis of that we saw the first Mustang in the next year. And it kind of continued to develop and develop and develop. And then we started seeing cross cultural items happen where the Japanese were taking from the US side of things. And as they were developing, suspension geometry and what engines to put in and how to develop reliability. And so now in the modern drifting world, it's, there's an amalgamation of the cultures all together. But I think a lot of that started when drifting was quote unquote Americanized, from the very beginning.
You were saying earlier about the kind of cultural, I don't know, the bridge you had to overcome, with, when you were working with Japanese business managers, and you sort of talked about a kind of melting pot here of American influence on the Japanese culture and Japanese influence on the American culture. I mean, looking at drifting today, are there still sort of two distinct cultures, or has it sort of merged together? How would you describe it?
It depends on what aspect of the sport you're looking at. I mean, in the United States for Formula Drift here, our events are very loud, ruckus, tons of people attending. It's screaming, it's going crazy, it's, flaming on the internet, it's freaking out, it's, having the time of your life. In Japan, the competition is just as exciting, but it doesn't have that kind of cachet. There's a respect, there's a golf clap. You're not, if you watch baseball games in Japan, you'll see how crazy it is inside the stadium. For some reason, it's not like that in drifting. People are hanging out, they're having a good time, but they're not necessarily going, you know, out of their mind for the competition. And so, in that sense, from a participation of a consumer, it is massively different. The action itself is quite similar.
Like on track, the kind of the style of car, the kind of the skill level, would you say it's kind of at a par, or do you think there are some subtle differences there?
There's going to be some subtle differences, but I think it is, it would be totally degrading to either side to say that there is a set of drivers or a driver that is clearly better than one side or the other. I mean, the Japanese gave us everything that we needed to get going, and the American guys or the US based teams kind of put their flavor on it. And they both have incredible driving abilities. And depending on, where you lay down on this, they're going to have differences in stylistic approach, not just aesthetically within the car builds, but also in the way that they drive. And so, you see some of those subtle differences there. But, put two guys that have been, behind a car for 10, 15 years, and, you're basically going to have a lot of the same skill set.
I don't know what I expected, but I looked at some of your current tracks, and within that, you have a bit of an overlap with IndyCar, which is the American series I tend to follow. You've got the Long Beach track, and you've got I guess I would call it Gateway Motorsport Park, but maybe it's changed its name to something like Worldwide Technology Raceway. Like, could you describe to us kind of how you use the track? Because you're not obviously trying to set an ultimate lap time. So if someone's listening is a novice to drift, you're showing up at one of these locations. How do you set it up, and how do you use that venue?
Yeah, so I mean, you're basically hitting on the biggest challenge that I think any drifting organizer, particularly us, has when trying to select venues that are going to make sense for a sport like ours. I think the ingredients for a sport like ours, you need to have every corner of the track viewable by every person in the venue. And so it has to be more like an American football or baseball game where it doesn't matter where you sit, you can at least see everything that's happening. So that's one constraint that you have. The other constraint that you have is that, the battles are they're successive, so they happen very quickly. And that means if we start at point A and we end at point B, and point B is on the opposite end of the track, we can't go do the second half of the battle until they get to back to point A. And so a lot of the venues need to have something that is reasonable to have those drivers get back to the start line. In some cases, in a perfect case scenario, we're starting and stopping relatively close to the same place. And so, that's one of the reasons why, and there are many others, where when we look at venues, we have to look at not just the logistics of it, but also the geography of the track itself, and to see if it has those attributes. And if not, can those attributes be created or added? And so you get these short course oval tracks that allow you to do that. But equally, if you have a motivated racing track facility like Road Atlanta or the Long Beach Grand Prix, as you mentioned, where that becomes possible because the interest is high enough for them to have an event like ours there, then you can make those kind of events happen. And that also is the same with Worldwide Technology Raceway, where the paving that they did there for drifting was specific for drifting and not used for anything else. And it was just to accommodate the needs that we have as a racing series.
Now you mention it, it makes a lot of sense because so I guess the motorsport that I've gone to watch the most is Formula One, and I say the most. I've been to 3 or 4 Grand Prix, but it's much harder to watch in person because you see the car, then it goes away, then you kind of looking at the score, and then you see it again a minute later. So what you're saying is, the venue, it needs to be sufficiently contained, or as you say, the kind of visibility needs to be high. You mentioned battle. That's an interesting word. So, like for our listeners that are not initiated in the world of drifting, what is a battle?
So, a battle is, it's a technical term, so capital B, but it's also kind of a term that came out of basically, people trying to describe what happens when you have two drivers competing against each other. So it kind of comes from the verbiage that people have developed over the years, and essentially it is very close to what it sounds like. The way drifting works is you have each driver with the ability to do a lead lap. So they will both lead one time and chase one time. And so you have 2 laps. And essentially, because they are fighting it out in that way, the term battle has been something that, we've kind of taken on as a technical term. So it's in our rule book with a capital B. But, there are other names for it as well, like tandem. But usually that comes as a prefix to like tandem battle. So, a battle basically just is those 2 drivers duking it out over the successive 2 laps that we require in order for a winner to be chosen.
No, I completely get it, and I guess it's all about car control at the end of the day. So before we get into sort of Formula Drift, and I'm really intrigued to hear about some of the history, some of the best drivers, perhaps drivers you would rate as all-time greats. Like, do you see which sort of motorsport beyond drifting is most comparable in terms of driver skill? Because it's clearly about car control. Where would you see the closest sort of relative in the motorsport world?
The only thing that I've seen that actually has a real world application and drivers have gone back and forth from either sport with certain amount of success is rally.
That makes sense, and Ken Block and others, presumably, the drifting around the corners, and I guess what we call it, the Scandinavian flick, is a small
Yep.
drift. Yeah. So where do your drivers come from? Because I guess there's the obviously grassroots scene, But there's so many people that we interview that are kind of either they're trying to get into motorsport or they've succeeded, but lots of their peers have fallen away. How do your drivers end up doing Formula Drift? Where have they come from?
The constituent parts of the series from a driver perspective are really, I would say, they're odd for a sport of our size. I mean, I think we have 14 different countries represented in our current driver pool. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that when Formula Drift kind of came online, we had these, periods of time where, and particularly when we started live streaming and social media started coming into play, where we had these really incredible jumps in growth, not just from consumers coming to the events, but also people that were consuming content and things like that. And, if you are a drifter in Brazil or, in Norway, and, the matter of you getting to continue to try to pursue your dream as an actual job, as a job, there was really only one place to do that, and that was Formula Drift. And so we started to get, guys that were coming over with these very modest programs. They may have sent a car over, or they may have built a car here, and they started to, compete in whatever our 7 or 8 round championship, whatever it was at the time. And slowly but surely, if they were successful, not just competitively, but also what was required as an athlete, in drifting and modern drifting in terms of representing brands and things like that, now they can basically say, okay, I've got 8 weekends of work a year where I've got to be at an event, but I can also be a representative for the brands. And I can also utilize this as a way to promote my own drifting business. And now what you see in the modern day is there's a, huge swath of drivers that have done very, very well for themselves in developing their motorsports program around Formula Drift. So whether they drive or whether they represent a brand, there are a lot of different avenues where support from the financial side of things can happen quite easily, I would say, quite easily relative to regular motorsports. So I think that that's one of the reasons why you see a lot of different competitors from countries outside of the United States, and one of the reasons why that's kind of continued to be a norm, so to speak.
Before we kind of talk about the current season or kind of where Formula Drift is now, we have a kind of question that we ask all our guests, which is, because we're all frustrated drivers, right, one way or another. So if you could pick any car to drive and sort of race it around any circuit, the question to you is which would you pick?
Well, I'm looking at the Singapore F1 Grand Prix track that I have hanging in my wall. It was a gift that was given to me because we were doing events in Southeast Asia for a long time. So I might as well say that, even though that's not a historic track, it's I think one of my favorite street racing venues or street circuits. And it would probably have to be either a classic Nissan S15 or something that is a little bit of a throwback to the beginning times of drifting, but not all the way back to like AE86s or the lower, horsepower vehicles, which I like. I've always been kind of a fan of the S15 look and feel with it and its balance approach and things like that.
It's interesting you picked that because I would say, I don't know, I don't see it as a kind of drifters circuit, but when I look at the Nissan S15, I'm just immediately taken back to the kind of Japanese car culture, and I don't know, I can just see Gran Turismo in my head. I don't know why. Maybe that was the car I always bought, but there we are. So, I mean, segueing back to Formula Drift, right? You're the president and co-founder, and you've had this long, amazing journey with it. Some people kind of are happy, they get content and they go, oh, do you know what? I've had enough of that. But what keeps you going, and what are your aspirations for Formula Drift looking ahead?
I mean, I think we've always kind of had a little bit of a chip on our shoulder that, in particular, we were not really recognized by the motorsports community because we don't have a how fast you get from point A to point B type of metric, and so trying to make it more than an entertainment sideshow or a spectacle was trying to make it a legitimate motorsport from the development of the cars all the way to the way that the events are run and function. And so if you have that, you're going to have things in front of you, markers that you're going to want to hit, and goals that you need to see happen before you start thinking about I've done everything I can do. So that's why, like, even at 21 years, I still have a lot of motivation to do this because we are seeing those things happen, and we're seeing them happen in different time frames. And also the sport has changed so dramatically over the past 10 years that it is almost completely something different than it was when we kind of set out to do this. And it's changed the dynamics of the way we think about it from a business perspective and the type of impact and relevance that it has in motorsports and in performance aftermarket in general. We've literally have companies that are just building drifting parts. We literally have companies that are expanding, their products that they supply because of all the things that are specific to drifting. The tires is such a huge factor. The manufacturers have looked very, very deeply at the how crazy and beat up the tires get and what that means for their manufacturing process and what that means for their regular consumer tires and how they might be able to make those last longer, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a ton of those things where as the sport goes on and as it's developed, it's taken on a different flavor than I think that we thought it was going to. However, the main goal of it still remains. We want to be respected as a legitimate motorsport. We want our athletes to be paid athletes. And if they're doing this for their dream as a professional, we want them to be compensated as a professional. And we want an industry to grow up around the sport such that it can help provide livings for people, whether you're a tuner or a fabricator or a parts manufacturer, or a marketing person, or you're representing a driver as an agent. Those are all things that you would consider norms within a regular industry. And those are things that, we are going after and trying to develop as part of our, long-term planning.
Yeah, I can kind of see that you're building a kind of not just an industry, but a community or a network of people that all benefit, which sounds incredible. And when you say you might have a chip on your shoulder, I can relate to that. But I guess not to blow too much smoke. Do you take some time sometimes to reflect on what you've achieved, and do you ever feel a sense of satisfaction?
It's hard. It's hard to do that objectively because there is a constant scrutiny, from, I mean, I think the thing to keep in mind is that most of the people in our sport are not from motorsports traditional. And they may or may not understand what it would be like to drive in a road racing series, or the cost associated with that, or how prize money works, or how media rights work, and things like that. All they know is that they were doing local drifting events, and all of a sudden they got their license to go to Formula Drift. They went into our prospect series and they did well. And 3 years later, they're considered a pro, and they are having to put together marketing programs and campaigns and figure out what to do with all the time that they have outside of the events. And so if you only have that, you're going to be wondering why that as soon as you become a professional, that you're not a millionaire. And that can be a little bit challenging for us to kind of swallow because it's not like that. You become a professional football player or baseball player or whatever. The organizational structure of the business is way different. This is a situation where you can become a professional in a much easier way, but in order to make it a long-term occupation, there are so many other things that need to be developed and organized around your program. And so even though, I can look back and say, wow, we've done this really cool thing where there's an industry built around it and we've got all these really cool events. I am constantly hounded all the time by our athletes on, what more are we doing to help them, get to where they need to be. And, a big part of that just is because, they don't necessarily have the traditional motorsports experience to know that most racing teams lose money. Most most people in motorsports do it as a tax write-off. And the registration fees are astronomical relative to what you get out of it, so to speak. And so these guys are coming in, utilizing the last few dollars they have, and it can be a shock to know that just because you become a professional doesn't mean you become a millionaire. But equally, there are people in this sport that have done absolutely incredible things in their business on the back of Formula Drift. I think about a guy like Von Gittin Jr., who has literally developed a brand alongside Ford and is probably the modern day Carroll Shelby, and has a massive complex in North Carolina that just does all of his motorsport stuff. And there's other drivers like that as well. And so it is possible to do it. It's just very different when you come from kind of no motorsports background to then jumping into it and like, how do I do this and be successful?
I get it, and you're going to hate this comparison, right? Because you just talked about the chip on your shoulder to build the legitimacy of your sport. But when I was younger, I used to follow. You know what I'm going to say? I used to follow wrestling, and
Yep.
there were two different, I guess, groups of fans, and one of them are the people that are the people, the purists that are like, oh, this person is technically the very best at what they do. And then there is the kind of larger group of people that are those that want to be entertained. And those people are appealed to, the big personalities and the people that really connect with the audience. So to try and bring it back to drift, do you, for your athletes, is there a kind of need for them to develop that personality, to develop that brand, to really try and connect with the audience and beyond?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one very clear indication of that is that if you look at the social media comparison numbers between, say, our top 10 athletes in almost any other motorsport besides F1, you will see that the drivers in our series themselves are influencers in the modern nomenclature that's used. And the ones that have done that well, have leaned into that, have been the ones that have really achieved that benefit. And that might be, as you say, developing a certain kind of personality. It might be utilizing a brand relationship that you have to be the Corvette guy or the Toyota guy or the Mustang guy or the BC Racing suspension guy. And the ones that have done that well have set themselves up very well to continue to do this for a long time. And it's, as you said, it's developing not just that personality, but also understanding that you as an athlete are a brand. And so you have to treat yourself as such and try to figure out the best way to be able to make that successful and monetize that.
It's fascinating because I can see that Vaughan Gittin Jr. won the kind of one Formula Drift in the US in 2010, and then he won it again in 2020. it seems therefore that it's quite a competitive sort of sport or series. Would you agree with that? Because obviously, when we look at other motorsports, and we'll talk about Formula One in a minute before we close, there's a lot of accusation around Formula One. It's usually not competitive. There are the odd season where it is, but generally there's one car with one driver, and they're just a way ahead. So yeah, Formula Drift, is it quite tight? Is it difficult to get the upper hand?
I think that is one of the things that makes our sport unique amongst motorsports is that you could bet your house, and just put the spending cap to the side for a second, because who knows what effect that's going to have over the next couple of years. But you could bet your house on almost any asset that you have that Williams is not going to win a race, or that one of the lower teams is not going to win a race in the upcoming season. And you would be right, most likely. It would take a miracle for that to happen because that's just not the way that F1 is structured. The best driver with the best car, unless it breaks, is usually going to win. And you might get a little bit of a back and forth, and everybody likes to see that, but you have these moments and years of dominance, whether it's Michael Schumacher or Verstappen or you name the driver that's had multiple championships. In drifting, that's not the case. You can literally have a guy that is ranked out of the top ranked drivers, say ranked 25th, that can win a race or can win an event. Now, the probability increases, obviously, if you're a better funded team and you're a more experienced driver. But the competition is such that it's not even close to describing it as impossible. It is not only possible, but oftentimes likely, depending on how the draws happen, that you might find yourself in a situation where you take out one of the big guys early on in the bracket, and then you've got a nice, easy bracket all the way down to the semifinals or the finals. And so we get years where we have 8 rounds with 7 different winners, for example, where we have the points are changing constantly from the middle of the pack, going into the top 10, out of the top 10, into the top 10, out of the top 10. And you're just seeing a lot more movement in the points in general than you do in traditional motorsports. But again, obviously that doesn't, change, say, fans of drifting or even some drivers to say, well, this guy always does well. This guy's always winning. When in fact, if you're talking about it in comparison to traditional motorsports, no, he's not always winning. His probabilities of him doing better are there, but obviously he's not winning every single race. He's not even getting on the podium every single race. He is doing enough cumulatively to get close to being in the championship, and he's going to have some early knockouts and some good events, just like everybody else. But there has been tons of examples over the years where a driver with 1/10 of the budget and development of a car has won or podiumed an event. It is not uncommon in this sport at all.
Wow, I love that. And I think everybody loves an underdog story, which is fantastic. So, speaking of that, I was just looking at when your next event is. So, for those that don't know, this is not a live show, which is just how technology works. We're recording this in early July. So, as I look at it, it looks like your next event is in St. Louis, Missouri. Is that right, or have I just made that up?
Nope, you got it right.
Brilliant. And how can people? Because obviously, I'd love to go to St. Louis, Missouri, but it's probably unlikely that my wife will let me. So, how can we watch or how can we follow along at home?
Yeah, so I mean, we that's another area where we're very different. Right now we do linear broadcast television in the United States and Canada, but we have retained all of our media rights within the series, and we share those amongst the drivers so that they can utilize our content to monetize and build themselves as an influencer. And so because of that, we do a multi-syndication model on our live stream broadcast. So whether it's our Facebook page, our YouTube channel, or any of the other distribution networks that we have on the internet, it's pretty easy to find. And, it's hosted right on our website or on any of those pages.
Brilliant. Well, if only other motorsport series can have that approach. I'm just looking here. We've got the Formula Drift channel on YouTube, which is I guess, my social media of choice, and you can see, recaps, I suppose, of all of the recent races, but also, as you say, like the Outer Zone podcast and sort of a range of different types of content, which is really refreshing.
Yeah, and we've kind of taken that tact, since social media became kind of a thing, and we saw that the nature of drifting really appealed to the behavior of activity on social media. It's a constant payoff. You're getting a winner every 30 seconds, so to speak.
Hmm.
And so if you have an attention span that needs to be, fulfilled more often, drifting is that kind of remedy, because you're just seeing these battles turn over and over and over, and you're constantly getting a result. Whereas, you might be waiting, an hour and a half or 2 hours to figure out who crosses the finish line, and the race might be over after the first lap, depending on who's out front. Minus some vehicle malfunction or something like that. So that's one of the things that's kind of made, I think, the sport different, is that it appeals to a much younger audience and demographic, which is what we need in motorsports right now as people age out. And, that's one of the things that we're continually trying to work on.
I don't know why, but I just love the phrase "age out," and I try not to think of it too graphically. But yeah, yeah, exactly. I think anything that can get eyes on motorsport, a new demographic, a new group of people, has my seal of approval. So I've just been looking through all of the main social media sort of purveyors. So I've just been on YouTube, and it was at Formula Drift. I've just been on. What is it, X, and it's at Formula Drift, and then on Instagram it's Formula D. So I can see all that, and I'd encourage everyone listening to follow. But I'm also hearing in your voice, Ryan, the way that you talk about, the race could be over after the first corner, that you are perhaps someone that is quite familiar with Formula One. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been a fan. I think the behind the veil of Formula
Mm.
One was always something that appealed to me. The fact that, under, say, Bernie's leadership, be outside looking in was very difficult. And you had to get it from certain sources, so there were certain magazines that would write about it, and you would learn about the business of F1. That's changed a little bit now, in the sense that, we've seen the new group, be much more open to being open with the sport. And I think actually it's been a huge net positive for the relevance of the sport outside of its core demographic. And the reason why you've probably seen the expansion of all these, American markets and other events, with Drive to Survive and things like that, is that they've opened up the doors, so to speak, to what's behind the wall. And it's really an awesome, amazing motorsport. Just looking at it conceptually, they deal with things that all other motorsports deal with, and Verstappen's winning every single race, and blah 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 blah, and all that kind of stuff. But the sport itself and what it represents and how it's developed and what it means in the kind of motorsports echelon is something that I've always been fascinated by, because it is the top of the top, and you get to see all these amazing manufacturers compete, and you don't really get to see that in many other places at the scale that it's done, with Formula One. So yeah, I've always been a huge fan.
That's my major sort of love in motorsport, is Formula One. I guess, like, as the co-founder of a motorsport series in North America, have you, and knowing that, I'm sure the likes of, maybe this is stereotypical, but Danny Rick and a few of the other drivers, I'm sure they'd love drifting and getting behind the wheel. Have you ever had any encounters or any kind of crossovers with the Formula One circus, as it were?
Yeah, yeah, in kind of odd ways. I mean, Daniel Ricciardo is a good example of somebody that's very familiar with drifting. He is part of a media company out here, in Southern California, that really kind of came out of the drifting culture and the, kind of the culture that surrounds that type of motorsport. I believe there is a video out there right now with one of our old drivers who's in New Zealand, with Max Verstappen drifting, his Red Bull drift car. So there, we have seen some of those elements. It's funny though, we were pitched to do a demonstration at the very first round of the Miami Grand Prix, and we were really excited about doing that. And then the FIA came down and said, "Oh, no, 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 we can't do that. There will be too much tire laid down on the track, and so that's going to disrupt, the competition or whatever." So it is kind of interesting when, when we have been approached by other more organizations. Like, us being out on track is not the same as a sub series being out on track. Like, we are gonna change the surface structure from what it is originally intended to be, to, over a very short period of time, a huge amount of rubber laid down on the asphalt, and obviously that can play a huge role at the speeds that certain cars are going. So it's weird. It is odd that, we almost have to kind of be by ourselves, because in conjunction with other motorsports, depending on who they are, it can be a little bit of oil and water.
I was literally just thinking that because I think there was a German Grand Prix at Hockenheim, maybe 2019 or something, where there was a drag strip right next to the track, and it was raining, and a couple of drivers went off over there, and essentially it was like ice. They just could not turn the car, couldn't stop the car. So it's interesting. Although you're obviously an extremely professional chap. I would wonder whether the FIA saying that they didn't, that, oh, you're damn, affect the surface of the Miami track. I wonder if that was all that was at play there, because those guys are very commercial, and maybe they had other things on their mind, but
Oh, I'm sure there was definitely more to it. I mean, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't go on the record in saying that that's what they said, because we're also part of the FIA Drifting Commission,
of
so we're
course.
kind of in that space. But
Mm.
I think it's one of the things that makes it unique or challenging, but also at the same time, it is, you know, you're going to see tons of tire smoke flying all around the track. It's going to be hitting, decibel meter levels that are well past 100. And so it just becomes a spectacle within whatever event you might be doing at, whether it's like a SEMA trade show, where we have to be outside in a way, uh, or you're doing it at a racing event in conjunction with other people. I mean, our experience. You mentioned the Long Beach Grand Prix. Our experience with the Long Beach Grand Prix is we have a kind of an out of championship competition on Friday and Saturday of the Grand Prix weekend, and we are the last thing to go on course. And we go at nighttime at a section of the course that we do our own competition at a week prior. And it becomes an absolute, like, just raucous, crazy moment for an hour and a half, 2 hours, depending on how much track time we have. And so it definitely has this kind of like very antithetical, let me sit down and relax and watch motorsports racing and da 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 da, that you get sometimes, until you get to the last lap, or you get to an accident or a crash or something like that. So yeah, I can certainly see other reasons for it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I can just imagine the way that drifting hypes up the crowd, and you've got me thinking, what's available in the UK. So I'm definitely gonna look out for that. We're getting to the end of our show. Before we ask you the all important question, which we'll leave to the end, is there a kind of closing message you'd like to leave with our listeners? Anything coming up, or anything you'd like to say?
Um, I think drifting is a very amazing sport. It's been around for a long time in terms of somebody's lifetime, so 21 years, but it's still very much in its infancy relative to other motorsports. And I think its identity is has now been kind of has come into fixation, so to speak, but the arrangement and development of all the elements on the peripheral are still very much being developed. And I think the ultimate outcome for the event, whether it's going to be, you know, like a NASCAR or like a DTM or whatever cultural kind of acceptance it's going to have, it for sure is going to be around young people. For some reason, this identifies with young people more than any other motorsport. And so a lot of the programming that we do is tailored towards that demographic. And it's one of the reasons why I think we become so different.
I can only wish you every success, and best of luck in growing the sport further. And you mentioned sort of this is the 21st season. I was kind of reflecting that, you know, Formula One's 21st season was in 1970, and look at how much the sport has grown from then till now. So I have every faith that Formula Drift is going to hit new heights as we move forward.
Yes, it'll probably be long past my time. I'll probably be the Bernie that everybody wants to get out at some point. But I hope that's the case.
I was literally, I don't know if we're on the same wavelength or anything, but I was literally going to call you the Bernie when you said this will be past my time. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I did note for the record, I did not call you the Bernie. You called yourself that. So I'm sure the sport will continue to grow. I can hear Georgie laughing in the background. So we ask all of our guests a final question, which is all about getting to the heart of their personality and soul. So the setup question is, and I don't know why I asked this, but just in case, Ryan, do you enjoy the occasional pizza?
Yes, sure.
Okay, right. See, it's an odd question, isn't it? Right. This is it. This is the peak of the show. Pineapple on pizza, yes or no?
I mean, it's not my first choice, but I don't have a problem with it.
Spoken like a true marketing professional. You're inclusive, you know. I love it. Brilliant. Yeah, it's not my first choice, but I did have a problem with it. Well, you defend my right to order pineapple should I choose. I would never choose, but that's fine. Right. Ryan, it's been a huge pleasure to have you on the show. Really appreciate your time this afternoon from Long Beach, this evening from the UK. Thank you so much.
Yeah, pleasure's all mine. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, guys, look, if you've made it this far into the episode, because you can tell I'm not a master marketer like Ryan, and I would have done this ad read earlier, then you should be giving us a thumbs up, a like, a 5-star review. And do you know what? If you've got feedback for us, even better, give us a comment on whichever platform you're interacting with us and listening to us. But until next time, I've been talking to Ryan Sage. This has been F1 Blag. Really pleased to be presenting the Georgie Stripping the Dipping podcast. Until next time, good night.